You enjoy the break. So next presentation in the conference is by Marie van Loon with a presentation on delusions being responsive to reasons. So with that, I'll stop sharing and I'll give it to Marie, who will introduce herself quickly and then go to her presentation. Take it away, Marie.
Thank you. Can everybody see my... Okay, great. So first I would like to thank the organizing committee for this conference, which already looks great. And I'm really excited to present this work to people who work actually on responsibility and psychopathology, because I work here in Zurich with epistemologists. So I've presented this paper to people on the ethics of belief, but never to people who actually work on the topic I'm interested in. So I'm both excited and anxious to hear what you will think. So almost unfailingly in the philosophical literature on responsibility, behaviors exercised in the context of mental illness are taken as paradigmatic instances of blameless acts and beliefs. People with addictions and schizophrenia often figure as foils to responsible and autonomous agents in classical work of philosophy. And they are notoriously the agents towards whom we adopt, in the words of Peter Strawson, the objective stance. In the last years, however, researchers like Hannah Pickard have stressed that this way of understanding the relation between psychopathology and agency is misleading. In her work on blame and addiction, Pickard explains how individuals with behavioral disorders, such as individuals struggling with addictions, exhibit and exercise more control than the philosophical traditions ascribes to them. Pickard discusses cases of behavioral, she discusses cases of behavioral disorders such as addiction and the false idea that the agents in these situations are coerced into acting. She points out that this is not really what goes on, and rather than feeling coerced into actions, what goes on is that people are having a really hard time resisting acting. Pickard stresses that psychopathology does not provide an example of what the world would be like without free will. Rather, the clinical world provides an example of where the potency of free will, whether or not this is ultimately illusory, is on clear display. So in some philosophy gets the wrong idea about psychopathologies and about their impact on people's ability to choose. And although Pickard's point is mostly directed at practical philosophy or moral responsibility, I thought it would be interesting to see whether, if her call extends to doxastic freedom as well, it would be possible to be responsible for doxastic attitudes that arises out of mental disorder, at least occasionally. So in this talk, I will focus on one type of so-called pathological belief, clinical delusions, and I will suggest that popular view of doxastic responsibility is able to respond to the invitation to take the possibility of doxastic freedom and by extension doxastic responsibility in psychopathologies seriously. So before going into the argument itself, I briefly clarified the object of my inquiry in clinical delusions. So philosophers of psychiatry seems to fall in agreement regarding the following general features of delusions. So delusions are beliefs that fail to conform to basic norms of good reasoning and which are often key symptoms of mental illness and of brain damage. The DSM-5 definition defines delusions as fixed beliefs that are not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. And their content is often implausible and perceived as recalcitrant to evidence, but in certain cases, their content seems perfectly ordinary. So for example, people with delusions might believe that they're the Messiah, that they're dead, that they're being persecuted, spied on, that their partner is being unfaithful, or that they're in a romantic relationship with someone, and so on. Do note that in this paper, I take delusions to be beliefs. So this view about the nature of delusions is, of course, debated, but I think this assumption makes sense in the context of this talk, insofar as the reason-responsiveness, which I'm going to talk about after, is a property of beliefs and not of acceptance, imaginings, speech acts, and other entities. Delusions are sometimes to be thought to be. So where do delusions stand in terms of doxastic responsibility prima facie? The issue is the following. In philosophy, beliefs are widely accepted to be entities that elude what philosophers call direct voluntary control. So by this, we mean that I cannot acquire the belief that I'm currently standing in the middle of the Rotem Act in the same way that I can just raise my arm. So this gives way to what people often call the challenge from doxastic involuntarism, which asks basically, can we still be doxastically free, or can we be responsible for our beliefs in spite of not having direct voluntary control over them? And a fair number of people in the literature think that it's the case. But in some, belief is off to a rough start in regard to the possibility of a conception of robust doxastic agency. But for those who accept that we can control and further be responsible for our beliefs, a certain picture emerges that props up belief up on a scale, the four ends of which classify or tend to classify beliefs that are more or less controllable or more or less free. And authors in the debate tend to tacitly accept this picture and generally situate delusions on the unfree end of that scale. A popular account of doxastic responsibility that has been put forward is the Reasons-responsiveness View, which identifies criteria for doxastic responsibility with a type of control that consists in being receptive and reactive to reason. So, of course, you will have recognized the account of Fisher and Ravisa of moral responsibility, but these authors, Steve McCormick and McHugh, they take this account from Fisher and Ravisa and they apply it to the doxastic case, making the necessary amendment. So at first sight, because this condition for doxastic responsibility requires, in some sense, sensitivity to evidence, it might look like delusions would clearly fail to meet this criteria. So after all, according to both the philosophical and empirical literature, individuals with delusions typically display insensitivity to the evidence by both being based on no or insufficient reasons to believe, but also being resistant to contrary evidence or alternative reasons to believe. However, in this talk, I'm going to propose that upon close examination and under a certain conception of delusion, delusions can sometimes meet the reason-responsiveness conditions for doxastic responsibility. So I will briefly give you a summary of the reason-responsiveness view for doxastic responsibility. So a similar claim has recently been defended by Carolina Flores in what I thought was a deeply insightful paper in which she offers an empirical argument against what is often taken to be a definitional aspect of delusions, that is their insensitivity to evidence. So although Flores's paper contributes to a slightly different debate, one that concerns the nature of delusions, I hope that by offering a conceptual argument that goes in the same directions, our views can be complementary. So Flores defines her own version of reason responsiveness, which she calls evidence responsiveness as follows. Rationally responding to evidence consists in changing one's attitude in epistemically permissible ways when one receives evidence. So this is pretty close to the conception of reason responsiveness I'm interested in, with the notable difference that the version of reason responsiveness I will focus on is meant to provide necessary and sufficient conditions for doxastic responsibility, not for rationality. So to get a first grasp on the working of reason responsiveness, let's first take a look at a case of non-delusional belief. So Claire believes that mangoes are dangerous for her health on the basis of what her parent told her growing up. This belief goes unquestioned for the rest of Claire's life. However, if Claire had been presented with the testimony of reliable studies suggesting that the risk of becoming ill after consuming mangoes are negligible, Claire would have recognized this evidence as a reason not to believe that mangoes are dangerous for her health, and on this basis would have revised her belief about the dangers of mango consumption. So one philosopher who defends the reason responsiveness view is Conor McHugh, and in this talk I will work with his particular account. So as I've already mentioned, the reason responsiveness condition divides into two subconditions. So we have on the one hand reasons receptivity, and according to reasons receptivity, Claire's mechanism of belief formation counts as receptive to reasons if and only if, in an appropriate range of alternatives of scenarios where this mechanism operates and her epistemic reasons vary, she recognizes those reasons. And the second part of the conditions is reasons reactivity, whereby Claire's mechanism of belief formation counts as reactive to reasons if and only if, in an appropriate range of those scenarios in which she recognizes reasons to believe otherwise, she reacts to these reasons she takes herself to have by forming the doxastic attitude they seem to her to dictate. All right, so a couple of remarks are in order because the account is actually pretty dense, but I won't go into the details today because it's not necessary for the point I'm trying to make. But I'll just draw your attention to a few precisions. So by mechanism here, McHugh, McCormick, they mean the way one comes to acquire or maintain a belief. It's pretty basic. And by appropriate range of scenario, what is meant is it's the range of what makes the range appropriate is whether the mechanism of belief formation that's operating is the same as in the actual sequence. And just a few words about the use of epistemic reasons here. What I have been, or what McHugh has in mind, what also McCormick has in mind, is considerations that pertain to the truth of a proposition and that are susceptible to constitute a basis on which to form and maintain beliefs. So there's the underlying assumption here is that epistemic reasons are evidence and not, for example, practical reasons to believe. So evidentialism is assumed here, but that also shouldn't matter for my point. So what explains why Claire is responsible in the vignette is that her belief that mangoes are dangerous for her health is that in counterfactual scenarios in which the mechanism of belief formation is the same, for example, testimony, and in which her reasons vary, for example, it's not alternatively to her parents' word, she gets exposed to studies about the risks attached to mango consumption. She would recognize these reasons to believe otherwise and react to these reasons by revising her belief that mangoes are dangerous for her health. So now the question is, can mechanisms of belief formation in cases of delusions ever be conceived of as being responsive to reasons in the same way? I will answer the question positively by arguing that a certain conception of delusion meets the condition for reason responsiveness. So to drive this point home, we need to look at a certain approach to the formation of delusions, sometimes called the cognitive deficit approach or the neuropsychological account. So according to this approach, delusions are the results of making sense of an anomalous experience. And note here that this anomalous experience alone doesn't seem to be sufficient to bring about the delusion. It takes place alongside various factors such as predisposition to psychosis, depression, anxiety, stress, lack of sleep, or yet the presence reasoning biases, or social isolation, amongst other factors. So consider the following case of famous case of delusion which is widely discussed in the literature on delusions, the Capgras delusions, in which a man who had previously suffered a severe head injury was convinced that his parents were imposters. The neuropsychological approach explains the Capgras delusions as being the result of a loss of affective response upon recognizing a familiar face, thereby creating this anomalous experience, and which consists, in this case, in an unusual feeling of derealization, of depersonalization. Yes, and so the neuropsychological approach explains the Capgras delusion as being the result of loss of affective response, and then it creates this anomalous experience. And further, this feeling is made sense of by forming the belief that the loved one has been replaced by an imposter. And this way of explaining the Capgras delusion is, to cite Gerons, closely tied to a view that normal and delusional patients are reasoning in essentially the same ways. So according to these views, the Capgras delusion is largely to be explained as a result of normal processes of belief formation. So according to this characterization of delusion formation, the subject seems to believe on the basis of their experience of their loved one's face, which happens to be abnormal. It seems plausible then that the mechanism of belief formation would react differently to some alternative reasons. In particular, if those alternative reasons were alternative experiences of reality, and more precisely, normal experiences of reality. So by this, I mean that if we take the mechanism of belief formation to be this endorsement of an anomalous experience, there does not seem to be any principled reason to conclude that the mechanism of belief formation in this case should be unresponsive to reasons. The next question is, of course, even if these strange experiences of reality count as reasons in the actual sequence, can they do so in counterfactual scenarios as well as required by reason responsiveness? So once more, I argue that there's nothing about the neuropsychological account that prevents us from inferring that this could be possible conceptually. And in order to see this, I invite you to compare with an alternative understanding of delusion formation, according to which the formation and maintenance of delusional beliefs are according to which the formation of delusional beliefs are ways to defend oneself against an imminent emotional threat, for instance, a risk of depression, which is too heavy to bear for the subject. So these approaches have been labeled as motivational approach or a psychodynamic approach, for example, by Bortolotti. So I will propose that by definition, this kind of mechanism is unresponsive to evidence in virtue of their function, which is to prevent the person from facing certain realities in order to protect their well-being or self-esteem. So consider the following case of reverse Othello delusion presented by Butler, 2000. A man became quadriplegic following a brain injury to a car accident. A year later, after the accident, it's called BX, gradually became deluded into thinking that he was still in a committed relationship with his partner, even though she had previously left him. His delusional beliefs included believing that he had been married for 5 weeks, that his wife was blonde, as well as beliefs about the details of their wedding ceremony. So according to the motivational approach, the belief that he is married protects BX from being faced with the hardship of his situation and risking a severe depression. So I think that under this particular approach, the mechanism of delusion formation can never meet reason's receptivity, and by extension, reason responsiveness. Here's why. This approach characterizes delusion formation as a mechanism which is meant to protect the self-esteem and well-being of the subject. And in this case, the subject delusionally believes that he's married to a woman who has in fact left him. And so in order to know whether the delusion arises out of a mechanism of belief formation that is receptive to reasons, we need to know whether the subject would recognize reasons to believe otherwise in counterfactual scenarios in which the same kind of mechanism is operative. And according to the motivational approach, the belief that he's married protects BX. And so to BX, reasons to believe otherwise, if he were to recognize them, would defeat the purpose of the mechanism of protecting his well-being. So in order for the mechanism to fulfill its protective purpose, it should not permit the subject to recognize these reasons to believe otherwise, were they to be faced with them. The same point can be made differently. If the mechanism of delusion formation's function is to protect the subject's well-being or self-esteem, then it cannot allow the subject to recognize reasons that would threaten their well-being. So for this reason, I think that the motivational approach, on the motivational approach, the mechanism of delusion formation is not receptive to reasons and therefore not responsive to reasons. So comparatively, the neuropsychological approach does better, and I will now provide further motivation by defending the view against a potential objection. So an objection with my proposal consists in pointing out that these delusional beliefs are not in a basing relation with these strange experiences, but merely in a causal relation. That is, these strange experiences merely cause people to form a delusion. So what epistemologists call the basing relation is the relation that takes place between a belief and certain reasons when a subject believes in light of those reasons rather than being caused to have these beliefs. So more precisely, a subject believes in light of a certain reasons when they treat a certain consideration as a normative reason to believe. So here I put the definition by Kurt Sylvan, but there's more definitions of, there's more views of the basing relation in the literature. And but it's the idea that the subject really treats a consideration as a reason that a reason to believe, as a good reason to believe. And a basing relation, at least not a causal relation, is required for reason responsiveness. So of course, if this relation doesn't take place in the case of delusion, the delusional beliefs cannot be responsive to reasons. I think there's two ways or two combined ways to resist this objection. So the first one would be to appeal to intuition and compare them to clear case, real case, but clear cases of belief causation. So compared to what happens with the way researchers talk about implicit bias and biased beliefs, where it seems that pure elements in our environments activate or trigger stereotypes, which results in biased beliefs or biased behavior, or the way an evil scientist would insert beliefs in my brain in a philosophical thought experiment. These looks much more like instances of causal relations than what happens in the cases of delusion, at least according to the neuropsychological account. And to build on that, we should also, I propose that we should look to first-person accounts of delusion formations. Consider this one, which is part of Daniel Freeman's podcast series on delusions, in which we hear a woman explain her experience of delusion, that she was dead. So my senses were all different. There was this feeling of being attracted, not really embodying my body, feelings of touch and being outside. Maybe normally you would feel a bit of wind over your cheek, but all these things felt different. The only experience that was near it, I would say, what would be being really jet lagged up all night, and then you get up and you have this sort of spongy head going on. So even though rationalization and confabulation might be involved in reporting the build up to a delusional conclusion, in a way, what happens here seems closer to the way we reason about our ordinary beliefs. So it seems reasonable that I would treat my normal experience of reality as a normative reason to believe. And if we reject that an anomalous experience of reality can count as a reason to believe, we should maybe also reject that normal experiences of reality count as reasons to believe, which I think sounds counterintuitive to me. So if we take these explanations, those first-person accounts of delusion formation seriously, it does seem that strange experiences of reality can play a basing role in the acquisition of a belief. So what we can conclude, if I'm right, with a big if, is there's two ways to go about it. So either we consider that my conclusion spotlight a virtue of the reason-responsiveness view, as it allows for a certain compatibility between delusions and doxastic freedom, and thereby meeting the spirit of Picard's research. People on the other side of the debate, people in doxastic responsibility who seem to be very attached to the intuition that we are not free when we have pathological beliefs, would take this conclusion to show that reason responsiveness is too weak. So if we persist with the intuition or buy into the tradition according to which psychopathology go hand in hand with a lack of freedom, that's what you might take away from my talk. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your insights.
Thank you, Marie.